So have you talked about your theory, say, with people in religious studies?
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you gain anything from that conversation? Because you're saying somehow there's something about people being on your land, in your territory, Western democracies, or somebody that you feel that shouldn't be there, that somehow inspires this.
And in fact, I learned quite a bit from the great scholars we have at our divinity school, because as I began to make these arguments, I of course didn't know much about the history of martyrdom, as it's say Christian martyrdom or Jewish martyrdom, and I'm learning about this as I'm doing the basic research. Well, they're telling me, often pointing me and guiding me to the literature, which shows that in fact there's a fair bit of similarity in the early martyrs that we note in our own religion, where in the case of both the Jewish martyrs, the Zealots and Zachari, and then the early Christian martyrs, we have cases where they're often acting in opposition to, in both of those cases, Roman occupation. And in fact, in the 2nd and 3rd century, where the Christian martyrs are becoming so prominent, that's really the heyday, if you would, of the large number of Christian martyrs. Many of them are martyring themselves, killing themselves deliberately, as an act of defiance against Roman occupation, often throwing themselves on the spears of Roman soldiers to try to manifest how they're willing to sacrifice their lives to support their religion in opposite, so that it becomes not something that is not dominated by Roman occupation or suppressed by Roman occupation.
Well, let me ask you, why did the Pentagon listen to you? I mean, it seems to me, given what you're saying now, the idea of sending a huge military force and presence right in the middle of the Middle East to Iraq is precisely the wrong kind of gesture.
You're absolutely right, and I've not been opposed to all military strategies in the past, but I have been fairly opposed to the war in Iraq precisely because it's exactly the kind of conflict which would produce suicide terrorism. And before our invasion of Iraq in March 2003, Iraq never experienced a suicide terrorist attack in its history. Never. Since then, suicide terrorism has been doubling every year. We've had 140,000 combat troops in the country, and I'm afraid it's right in line with expectations. Well, why didn't they listen? Well, partly it's because the research that I'm doing here, it took a few years to actually publish. It wasn't first published, even as an academic article, until the summer of 2003. Now, yes, I'd actually sent copies of the research to people in the Pentagon before that, but we have to recognize that on 9/11, that's when many of these policies were taken. Even interest in going into Iraq stems from shortly after toppling the Taliban in the fall of 2001, and we have to accept that the fact is we had quite a vacuum of information about what was causing suicide terrorism. Most people believed, and I think this is true not just in the Bush administration, but in the public at large, that suicide terrorism was the product of Islamic fundamentalism, an evil ideology that we should try to wring out of Muslim societies. And I have to admit myself, on 9/11, I kind of reached for the Quran. What's wrong with Islam? And it wasn't really until I put the research together, and it wasn't just me. This involves a research team of 10 people who are fluent in all the key native languages. We really are collecting a rather voluminous amount of new information, and I'm afraid that kind of systematic work, although I really wish it had been there and ready for on 9/11 itself, took some time. And now, in the last 6 months, I've been on Capitol Hill 4 times, speaking to both Republicans and Democrats, senators and representatives.
Are they listening to you now? Are they listening to you now?
Well, many are spending an hour and a half at a crack to really listen to the talk and go through this. And in Washington, probably the best measure of merit is time, because time is just so precious. So for me I've probably addressed 40 of our 535 senators and representatives, as I said, for about an hour and a half. It's extremely unusual for that to ever happen for me. This is the first time in my career that's happened, and it's extremely unusual to have anything more than a few minutes of the time of such busy people. And I've also been to the Department of Defense, where I've given the same sort of a talk for a longer period, say 3 hours, with people who really want to fight with every single issue, to the Office of Force Transformation in the Department of Defense. Well, Rumsfeld, you might know, is famous for transformation. So this is really quite an important part of the Pentagon. And just last week, I was at the National Security Agency, the NSA, the famous people who do all the eavesdropping, which have been recently in the news, to speak to 120 analysts who are doing intelligence on terrorism. And we again spent a 3-hour session where we went over the arguments and the data and the patterns in great detail. And I think that really gives you a sense that people are really coming to grips with this, because it really isn't the case that there's somebody else who has collected the global patterns of suicide terrorism. Many people have studied terrorism.
Which is astonishing.
It is, but it takes a fair bit of effort.
Right.
And in fact, we should recognize that for the last few years, many people in the government, even intelligence officials of all different stripes, have been really focusing on trying to fight the war in Iraq. So they've had a different focus, which we may wish they didn't, but the fact is they have been doing something else. So,
well, let me ask you. So, what now that we have this conflagration happening, which by your own analysis can only get worse as long as we have the irritant of our presence, or the U.S. presence and the so-called coalition presence there. How do you move forward from this point?
Well, we certainly can't just stay the course. And we also can't simply cut and run. Iraq is not Vietnam because of oil. We have an interest in access to oil in the Persian Gulf, and that's why at the end of the book I develop a new strategy. It's a true new strategy. It's not simply a Democratic strategy, and it's not simply a Republican strategy. In fact, I've had a nice letter from Bill Clinton about this, and I've had nice comments from Dick Lugar, a Republican senator, about this, which is to go toward a new strategy called offshore balancing. This is a strategy that we should implement not quickly. We shouldn't just cut and run and draw down forces overnight, but over a 3 or 4 year period, including starting just this year, we should systematically withdraw forces, ground combat forces from the Arabian Peninsula, and move toward this other strategy of offshore balancing to secure our interest in oil. Well, offshore balancing is having forces poised at the ready offshore to enter if we need to secure our interest in oil. And in fact, it's the strategy we pursued for decades before 1990. Even many experts don't remember that before 1990, the United States secured its interest in oil in the Arabian Peninsula without stationing a single combat soldier on the Arabian Peninsula. Yes, advisors with a few sidearms at some embassies, but no tanks, fighter aircraft, or APCs going all the way back to World War II. We hadn't done it at all. Well, that strategy relies on having a good alliance with Iraq and Saudi Arabia, which we can do again. It relies on having aircraft carriers off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and air power today is even more effective than 30 years ago. And it relies on having bases on the Arabian Peninsula, bases without troops, but bases so that we could rapidly deploy troops in a crisis.
But if we have bases, then we're there.
No.
You mean the offshore?
In the 1980s, we had the reason we could, in 1990, before 1990, we had no combat soldiers on the Arabian Peninsula. But remember, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and within 6 months, we had over 500,000 American troops in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Arabian Peninsula.
So we could say that that's, in a sense, what, from your analysis, was the final irritant for Osama bin Laden.
That we stayed.
In a sense, the Iraq, the first Gulf War.
It wasn't so much that we went there in 1990 as we never left.
That's what I mean. Then we had the troops that didn't go. So excuse me for interrupting you. So, but where are these bases going to be? I don't quite understand. If you're not on the land,
we don't actually.
You're offshore. You're offshore.
No, the bases can be the same bases we have currently. And in fact, in the 1980s, the reason we could move the forces in 1990 so quickly is we had built the bases in the 1980s. All the airfields in Saudi Arabia, when were they built? When was all that concrete laid down? In the 70s
Right.
and 80s, with no American fighters, no American aircraft, and in fact, no hardly any pre-positioned equipment. Just having the bare bones infrastructure of the bases made it possible for us to rapidly redeploy our ground forces. And in fact, we have virtually the basing infrastructure we need. So once we remove our ground combat forces from Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula over, say, a 3 or 4 year period of time, we really have the basing structure we need.
But why wouldn't Osama bin Laden and that crowd be just as angry about having the possibility of I mean, if you've got the bases, then I mean, why wouldn't they say we just want to get rid of the possibility of that?